part of how we really are. One, persistence and change. Habit is, as it were, a second nature. Cicero. Every so often, my cousin goes on Facebook to proclaim that she's going to change her life. In her case, that means losing weight. It always starts the same way. She has regrets. She weighs more than she wants. She has a bad back and the extra pounds are making it worse. Then she sums it up in language we can all appreciate. She says she feels stuck. She feels like she's unable to change. Lastly, she asks for help from her social media friends. The world of social media is broadly encouraging. You can do it. If anyone can, it's you. There's nothing I know you can't do. You're one of the strongest women I know. This weight loss thing will not defeat you. Her friends bolster her. They successfully play their parts in the sophisticated social process that my cousin is initiating. First, her commitments are shared with her peers, and therefore become stronger and more vivid for her. But there's a second, less obvious step to it. She's also raised the stakes of failing. Her public statements hold her accountable for succeeding. Compared with just a private resolution to lose some weight, her public performance makes disappointment costlier. That's what gives the dramatic edge to these posts. She doesn't just say she would like to lose some weight. She vows that this time she will make it happen. Her friends respond with advice appropriate for a hero starting her journey. Never believe them when they say you can't. She isn't going to just lose 15 pounds. She's going to start a new life. Her resolve is clear and strong, and she's made that resolve public. And yet, we all know where this is going. Classical economics gives us a lens on my cousin's dilemma. Homo economicus, or the economic human, refers to our supposedly immutable and rational self-interest. The kind that would make economic behavior as predictable as algebra. As good exemplars of Homo economicus, we are thought to be utility maximizers. Essentially, we are expected to always be rationally in pursuit of beneficial goals. The notion of this excellent rational figure came into sharp focus about 200 years ago in the work of political theorist John Stuart Mill. But even back then, his idea attracted scorn and criticism. In fact, it was early critics of Mill's overweening view of our collective rationality who coined the term Homo economicus to caricature his analysis. Ever since, gradually, and in fits and starts, the field of economics has developed a more realistic and more labyrinthine understanding of human nature. Eventually, even the most fundamental tenets of our economics were amended in light of our stubborn irrationalities. Not even the godfather of modern economics was left alone. It may be true, as Adam Smith said, that we all act in regard to own interest, but that interest can be defined with spectacular, that is, human, variety. I couldn't help but think of Homo economicus when I saw my cousin's post. If she were a purely rational creature governed by clear intentions, then she could simply and quietly change her lifestyle. No announcement necessary. How hard is it, really, to change ourselves? Like most of us, my cousin intuitively knew the answer. It's pretty hard. So she came up with some proactive ways to commit to that change. She bound herself to her plans and raised the costs of failure. She went beyond simply choosing to change. She started to craft her own social environment into one that made it harder for her to not lose weight. This should have worked when it did. 2 weeks after her first post, she updated, down 2 pounds. That's a great beginning. But then, silence. A month later, she posted that she was still trying, but without much success. No weight loss to tell you about yet. And that was her last post for a while on the topic. When I met up with her again 6 months later, she hadn't lost any additional weight. In fact, the only change was that now she had an additional failure to feel bad about, a costly public one. The end result for her, as for so many people who try to change their behavior, is that it just didn't happen. She had desire, she had determination, and she had some peer support. They're supposed to be enough, but they're not. The beginning of a solution to this problem is to acknowledge that we aren't fully rational. The reasons behind our actions can be obscure. The things that sustain us can be surprising. Scientists have only recently begun to unravel the multifaceted nature of ourself and to identify our resulting biases and preferences. With this understanding, we can never fully undo these influences, but we can account for them when we act. Our own behavior springs from some of the most mysterious, deeply hidden, and unrecognized sources of irrationality. What's derailing my cousin's attempts to change? What's derailing all of us? The answer is that we don't really understand what drives our behavior. The problem goes even deeper than that. We need to stop overestimating our rational selves and, instead, come to understand that we are made up of deeper parts, too. We can think of these other parts as whole other selves, just waiting to be recognized and given the command to get to work. Science is finally starting to reveal why we have been unable to change our own behavior. Better yet, it's showing us how to take this new knowledge and formulate a plan to effect lasting change in our lives. Perhaps you tried to save money by following a budget, or you attempted to learn a new language through an online class. Maybe your goal was to get out more and meet new people. At the start, your intentions were strong, passionate, resolute. Over time, you couldn't maintain that commitment, and the outcome you wanted just hasn't happened. This is a common enough human experience. We want to make a change, and we form strong intentions. Supposedly that's all it takes. Just think about how univocal common wisdom is on this subject. From "she just didn't want it enough" to "are you giving it your best shot?" This facile reasoning begins in early childhood and doesn't let up until the very end, that stage of life when many of us will have to fight against diseases such as cancer. The ethos is that your willpower is everything. Self-change therefore becomes a kind of test of our personhood, or at least our conscious part. Nike's famous slogan may have begun with some irony, but the resolute quality of the message, and our receptiveness, has instead made it into the secular commandment that it is today. Just do it. The corollary is this: if we aren't, then we must be just choosing not to. I bet that'd be news to my cousin and to all of her friends. She clearly made a choice, and she clearly tried to make it happen. It just didn't. Unfortunately, under these conditions, failure is especially disheartening. Comparison with more successful people becomes painful. It's hard not to contrast our own failures to change with people who are highly successful at persisting in their commitments. Professional athletes who train for hours every day. Musicians who spend months preparing for a performance. Successful writers who continually turn out page after page until they complete a project. We see these super performers and can interpret their mysterious and enviable success only through the lens of willpower. They must be just doing it. But why, then, can't we? Why do our life achievements look puny next to theirs? We end up feeling small. It's easy for each of us to conclude that we just don't measure up, that if we just made a strong enough commitment to change, we, too, could be thriving. But we didn't have that willpower. We couldn't just do it. This has become a national phenomenon. When Americans are surveyed about the biggest barrier to weight loss for the obese, lack of willpower is cited most often. 2/3 of us believe that obesity results from lack of control over eating. Even obese people themselves report that their own lack of willpower is the biggest obstacle to losing weight. 81% said that lack of self-control was their undoing. Not surprisingly, almost all of these respondents in the survey had tried to change. They had dieted and exercised, but to no avail. Some had tried to lose weight more than 20 times. Yet they still believed that they were deficient in willpower. 3/4 is a big majority. About 3/4 of Americans presently understand that the Earth revolves around the sun. In other words, it's established fact. Willpower deficiency is the problem. And yet, my cousin's story is hardly unique. I bet that every single one of us has had a similar experience. Every single one of us has failed to evidence willpower. Yet we continue to believe in it. We assign it astronomical authority when it delivers astrological results. What's the missing ingredient that makes real, lasting change possible? This is the puzzle that initially attracted me to the study of behavior change. Why is it easy to make that initial decision to change, and even to start to do some of the right things, but difficult to persist in the longer term? As a graduate student and young professor, I saw some of my most motivated and talented colleagues struggle with this dilemma. They wanted to achieve, and they started interesting projects, but they couldn't meet the challenge of continually being productive in the highly unstructured university environment. Early in my career, a bright graduate student who had a problem with procrastination joined my lab. He excelled in the classroom but seemed to get lost when working on self-directed research projects. I tried to help him by setting up regular work times and small milestones for completion. He ultimately came up against a hard university deadline. In order to continue, he had to submit his thesis proposal by a given date. On that morning, I showed up early to the office, hoping to read his work, and I was greeted by the picture of a tombstone he had hung on my door. I understood. He never met the deadline and abandoned his dreams of an academic career. If you have ever spent time in a university setting, you quickly learn that intelligence and motivation have little to do with getting things done on a regular basis. So what does? It seems to me that the willpower hypothesis comes from an initial error, but in many ways, a rational one. When my cousin decided to lose weight, or when you decide to switch careers, it feels like the most important component has been accomplished. The world is a noisy, chaotic place, inhibiting us from making critical decisions. Most of us avoid making those decisions until we have to. So when we do, it feels like a triumph. We lose a few pounds, we make the job switch. But then things slow down. Willpower isn't the issue. If you'd asked my cousin whether or not she still wanted her goal a few weeks after that initial post, I'm sure she'd say yes. Science is showing that, regardless of Nike ads and conventional wisdom, we are not one single unified whole. In psychological terms, we do not have a single mind. Instead, our minds are composed of multiple separate but interconnected mechanisms that guide behavior. Some of these mechanisms, it turns out, are suited to handle change. These are the features we know, our decision-making ability, and willpower. These are familiar because we consciously experience them. When we make decisions, we consciously attend to relevant information and generate solutions. When we exert willpower, we actively engage mental effort and energy. Decisions and willpower draw on what we call executive control functions in the mind and brain, which are thoughtful cognitive processes. To select and monitor actions, we are mostly aware of these processes. They are our subjective reality, or the sense of agency that we recognize as me, much as we experience the stress of exerting physical strength. We are aware of the heavy lift of exerting mental strength. Executive control must be paid its due. Many of life's challenges require nothing more than this. A decision to ask for a raise at work starts with setting an appointment with your boss. You carefully phrase your request and outline your reasons. Or, you decide to add some romance to your life by asking that attractive person at the gym to meet for coffee. After some deliberation, you find an appropriately casual way to do so. Decisiveness works in these one-off events. We make our decision, steel our resolve, and muster our strength to follow through. Other parts of our lives, however, are stubbornly resistant to executive control, and thinking every time we act would, in any case, be a highly inefficient way of conducting our lives. I'll return to this later, but can you imagine trying to make the decision to go to the gym every single time you went? You'd be condemning yourself to rekindling the ardor of day one every single day. You'd be forcing your mind to go through that exhausting process of engaging with all the reasons that you felt you should be going to the gym in the first place. And, because our minds are wonderfully, irrationally adversarial, you'd have to run through the reasons not to go, too, each time, every day. That's how decision-making works. You would constantly be in the throes of heavy mental lifting, with little time to think about anything else. What we're going to discover in this book is that there are other parts of our mind, parts that are specifically suited to establishing repeated patterns of behavior. These are our habits, better suited to working automatically than to engaging in the noisy, combative work of the debate chamber that usually accompanies our decision-making. What we'll also see is that a whole lot of life is already contained in those automatic parts. The simple, assiduous parts of yourself that you can set to a task. What could be better than that for accomplishing important and long-term goals? Skip the debate chamber and get to work. That's exactly what habits are for. Science and our own experience have shown that our minds naturally form habits, both innocuous and consequential. I bet the first 15 minutes you're awake goes about exactly the same each morning. That's natural, but it's easy to conclude that our minds must be constantly creating and recreating active, deliberate tendencies to persist. It's easy to believe that persistence comes from our repeated, conscious efforts to shape our actions to meet our goals. If our patterns of behavior were the result of just doing it, as too many of us believe, then our conscious minds must be choosing to keep doing the things that it does every day. Right, they might if we force them, but our conscious minds have little contact with all kinds of things we do, especially habitual things. Instead, a vast, semi-hidden non-conscious apparatus is at work. One that we can steer with signals and cues from our conscious mind, but one that ultimately runs on its own, without all that much meddling from executive control. These parts of us are vastly different from the conscious selves we know, and can be utilized in hugely different ways. The self we know is concerned with raises and romance. Our non-conscious selves are forming habits that enable us to easily repeat what we have done in the past. We have little conscious experience of forming a habit or acting out of habit. We do not control our habits in the same way as we do our conscious decisions. This is the under-the-surface, hidden nature of habit. It explains how our casual conversation on the subject is marked by an odd sense of submission. Well, that's just my habit. As though habits almost exist separately from us, or run in parallel to the selves that we experience. And it's true, habits have been a mystery, stuck for decades in the idea that breaking bad habits or forming beneficial new ones is simply about intention and willpower. Before we go further, it's important to highlight that the same learning mechanisms are responsible for our good habits, meaning ones that are aligned with our goals, and for our bad habits, the ones that conflict with goals. Good or bad, habits have the same origins. They result in very different experiences, of course, but don't let that color how you think of them. In this regard, going to the gym regularly and smoking a couple of cigarettes a day are the same. The exact same mechanisms are at work. But for our health goals, exercising and smoking are polar opposites. The purpose of this book is to show how we can use our conscious understanding of our goals to orient our habitual selves. We can set the agenda, we can direct. If we know how habits work, then we can create points of contact between them and our goals so that they sync in astonishingly advantageous ways. They already do in some cases, as we'll see. I trained as a graduate student in one of the top attitude research labs in the world. We presented people with information on a specific topic and tested whether it influenced their judgments and opinions. We developed powerful models of how people go about changing their attitudes and behavior. Our focus was on the initial stages of change, how to influence people to adopt new views of the world. We studied, for example, the ways that persuasive appeals create support for environmental policies. It was important, valuable work. As I said earlier, many life decisions are primarily subject to executive control, the cockpit for initial changes in our lives. But other things require more than initial decision-making and will: becoming a better parent, a more responsive spouse, a more productive employee, a more diligent student, or a more prudent spender. These changes don't happen all at once. Instead, they play out over long periods of time, years, with actions that have to be constantly maintained. If your goal is to reduce your environmental footprint, it's not enough to take the bus home from work tonight. You have to do so today, tomorrow, and into the future. To become solvent and pay off your debts, it is not enough to forego buying those new shoes or that new phone. You have to resist making purchases repeatedly, at least until your accounts are in the black. To form new relationships, you have to persist even if the first person at the gym turns down your coffee invitation. You have to meet more people you might like and repeatedly make offers to connect with them. You have to somehow become committed to the consistent procedures of doing things. I quickly realized, when starting my own research, that persistence was special. I didn't actually set out to study habit. I wanted to understand how people persist. The conventional wisdom was that persistence required strong attitudes, strong enough to get people to make a change and then stick with it in the long term. I realized that it was possible to test this idea on a grand scale by reviewing all of the research that had measured what people wanted and intended to do. Sign up for a class, get a flu shot, recycle, take the bus, and then tested what they actually did. Did they follow through on their intentions and sign up, get a shot, recycle, or take the bus? It seemed a simple, obvious question, and one that should have a straightforward answer. I, along with one of my students, Judy Owlett, systematically reviewed 64 studies including more than 5,000 research participants. What we found was surprising. For some behaviors, people acted as expected. If they said that they intended to enroll in a class or get a flu shot, then they typically enrolled or got a vaccine. For these one-off, occasional behaviors, conscious decisions ruled, and people with strong attitudes just did them. The stronger their plans, the more likely they were to perform the action. But other behaviors were puzzling. With actions that could be repeated often, like recycling or taking the bus, intentions didn't matter very much. Thus, people might want to recycle their trash or take the bus to work in the morning, but their behavior did not follow. If they typically threw everything in the landfill, then they continued to do that, regardless of their intentions to recycle. If they usually drove to work, then they carried on doing so, despite their intentions to take the bus. With some behaviors, people's attitudes and plans had little impact on how they acted. These results were unexpected. It should have been the case that once people made a decision to act and formed a strong intention, they just did it. When I went to publish the results, the journal editor asked me to redo the analyses, but I found the same thing again. So they asked for a whole new study validating the results. Again, we discovered that repeated actions were different. People could consciously report strong attitudes and plans, but they continued their past actions regardless. Finally, the research got published, and it has since been replicated hundreds of times. Of course, not all scientists were convinced. Some argued vehemently against the findings, believing that conscious attitudes and intentions are sufficient to explain behavior. For that early research proved pivotal in identifying the special nature of persistence. By special, I mean that persistence wasn't connected to what we had previously thought. It didn't seem to be connected to anything in accepted models, and it didn't follow the formula suggested by conventional wisdom. Persistence seemed to be more than what we assumed it was, and somewhat stranger, too. It turned out that we couldn't just conjure it up by asking people to state their intentions. Persistence mostly did not reflect strong attitudes and plans. But the critics were correct in a way, because my initial research did not explain what does lead people to persist. We knew it was special. We didn't know how to make it happen. It has taken decades, but that criticism has finally been addressed. We now know that it's habit that creates persistence. This book explains what we have learned about how to create habits. The myth that behavior change involves little more than strong intentions and the willpower to implement them has been operating successfully for a long time, so it's useful to think about it critically. Exactly how would employing executive control work in implementing long-lasting change? We know that when people are really decisive and committed to losing weight, it is possible for them to lose 15 or 20 pounds. This is the amount of weight an obese person can expect to lose over a 6-month weight loss program. 5 that counts for something. But we know more. Eventually, most people in such programs fall back into their old eating and exercising patterns. 5 years after taking part in a typical weight loss program, only about 15% of participants have kept off even 10 pounds. 6 the vast majority are back to their original weight, or have even gained more. That counts for nothing. Commercial weight control programs are aware of these data. I talked with David Kirchhoff, former president and CEO of Weight Watchers, about the long-term success of their members. He admitted, in the great majority of cases, when making change efforts, people just can't stick with it. Anybody who does Weight Watchers long enough will ultimately be successful, if they're actually doing the program. What we saw was that most people don't. This is the other side of Weight Watchers. To stay on a program like Weight Watchers involves constant struggle. I think about it sort of like this, Kirchhoff said. If you have a weight loss problem, you will always have a weight loss problem. If you're wired to overconsume, if you use food in a certain way, if you struggle with food because your metabolism is set a certain way, it is a chronic condition that never goes away. There's no cure for obesity, which means, periodically, you're going to fall off the wagon. Then you need to get back on track. It's not like you go through Weight Watchers, lose your weight, and it stays off. You're done. This is a difficult way to go through life. As Kirchhoff reported, in so many Weight Watchers meetings, you saw the struggle and the pain. You saw people who would lose 100 pounds, then they would gain it all back. You saw the impact that it had on them. They feel horrible. They feel like a complete failure. Their confidence is just shaken to the bone. Weight control is a particularly useful example only because it can easily be quantified and because it has been widely studied. But the same dynamics are at play if you're trying to spend more quality time with your kids, or to save money, or to stay focused at work. The problem is that the strong intentions and willpower theory of self-change drastically underestimates the likelihood of backsliding. Let's consider how my cousin would try to persist in losing weight through the sheer force of her decisions, without developing new habits. She will be making that decision in a hostile environment. She regularly buys a lot of junk food for her teenage kids. The result is a kitchen full of crackers, chips, cookies, soda, ice cream. Food is everywhere, sitting on counters, in the cupboards, and packed into the fridge and freezer. In this environment, joined by constantly snacking kids, she eats while watching TV, talking on the phone, and entertaining family. She likes to go to the mall and always makes time for a fast food break. Her life seems to revolve around eating while doing. It's worth noting here that the natural environment is not inherently hostile. Our ancient ancestors would surely be amused by the idea that food was anything but scarce, and that one day we would be bedeviled by its superabundance. But the problem isn't just abundance. According to David Kessler, the former FDA commissioner, the food industry is not just aiming to satisfy its customers. The industry, including the growers, concoctors, testers, packagers, marketers, distributors, and retailers, is investing in hyper-stimulating foods, creations with the power to keep us eating. There are scientists hard at work right now devising ways to get you to eat more than you naturally desire. It's important to know this, not to develop a sense of powerlessness, but to preserve our sense of self despite repeated failures. Today's environment poses a big challenge, and we'll meet it and win only if we are able to take its full measure. Compounding this challenge, my cousin lives in a suburb that does not make it easy to exercise. Her town was built for driving, not walking. She has 3 cars in the driveway, only a few short steps from her front door, and her house is cozy, without room for bulky exercise equipment. To follow through on her intentions in this environment, she would have to continually resist the lure of overconsuming and undermoving. Her life would become one difficult decision after another. Every day would feel like day one, like Groundhog Day, repeatedly resisting the same conveniences and comforts, repeatedly addressing herself to her underlying weakness, repeatedly testing herself. Decision and will simply aren't the tools to use for making continued sacrifices in order to persist at our new goals. It's too taxing, and would leave us with no time to think about anything else. Even more, the melodrama of this continued self-denial is counterproductive. Psychologist Daniel Wegner and his colleagues devised an experiment to demonstrate the ironic effect of inhibiting our desires. Participants were instructed in a simple task, not thinking of a white bear. Who spends much time thinking of white bears, anyway? Participants sat alone in a lab room for 5 minutes and rang a bell every time they failed to suppress this thought. On average, they rang the bell about 5 times, almost once per minute. No surprise that our thoughts wander, even to forbidden topics, when we are alone and bored. What is interesting is what happened when the same participants later sat for 5 minutes trying to think of a white bear. After the suppression task, they rang the bell almost 8 times. In contrast, participants instructed to try to think of a white bear for 5 minutes, but without the initial task of not doing so, rang the bell fewer than 5 times. It was as if the act of trying to suppress a thought gave it a special energy to emerge later. After the participants tried not to think about white bears, thoughts of them returned again and again. When rating their experience, participants who had initially suppressed thoughts of white bears reported feeling preoccupied with them, This is desire's ironic twist. Trying to suppress it undermines our best intentions and makes our goals harder to achieve. It confounds our good behavior by turning it into torture. As Wagner explained, we stay awake worrying that we cannot sleep, and we spend all day mentally in the refrigerator when we are hoping to die at 10. Exerting control has an oppositional quality that always seems to haunt attempts to direct our minds. At this point, when our unmet desires loom large and our motivation is at a low ebb, our conscious, thinking selves jump in. Consciousness is facile and easily comes up with justifications for quitting. Excuse-making is a talent at which our conscious minds excel. In the moment, you can rationalize eating last night's pizza or skipping the gym today. This talent allows us eventually to stop fighting ourselves and our environment. We are back to where we started. Our lives could be very different if we took advantage of the emerging science on how, when, and why habits work. For something so integral to the human condition, our habits are paradoxically counterintuitive. As you will see, this unknowability is a defining feature of habits that helps make them successful at what they do, persist despite our conscious intentions to do otherwise. Our conscious, aware self, the part of us we experience moment by moment when we make decisions, express emotions, and exert willpower, is the part we encounter every day. We have the ability to introspect, but we run into the philosophical conundrum of applying our own perceptual and cognitive apparatus to understand itself. We can only know the knowable parts of our experience. Habits work so smoothly that we hardly ever think about them. The world of habit is so self-contained, it makes sense to think of it as a kind of second self. A side of you that lives in the shadow cast by the thinking mind you know so well. Understanding how this works requires the full resources of psychology and neuroscience. Every once in a while, of course, our habits attract conscious thought. After making a resolution to talk and not message with coworkers, we trash that angry email we automatically started writing. When we remember to conserve water, we turn off the shower. We remind ourselves to put down our phones when having dinner with our kids. We are engaging in executive control, or top-down processing, by controlling our unwanted habits with our better intentions. This is the way many of us live. Our conscious decision-making self is pitted against our habitual, automatic responses. We are wrenched over and over by bad habits, in a sort of internal war. But there is another way. We can change unwanted habits and form good ones that are consistent with our goals. When our automatic response is the desired one, our habits and goals are in harmony. We no longer have to rely on will. This is the payoff to this book, understanding how to form good habits amid the pitfalls of daily life. We can learn to form habits that efficiently work with us, not against us. The truth is that many of your virtues are already habitual. Perhaps you automatically lock the front door when you leave the house. Use the turn signal in your car when you are about to change lanes or make a turn. Kiss your kids every day before they go to school. You might think that you do these things because you intend to do so. More likely, such regularly repeated responses are habits. Habits proceed so efficiently and quietly, we think we must have consciously decided to perform them. When habits and goals are in line, they smoothly integrate to guide our actions. Most of the time, we aren't even aware that it's happening. We act out of habit without having to make a decision to do so. As we will see, the habitual mind is in many ways less impressive than our conscious, thinking self. It certainly attracts less attention, but it works with great efficiency. We mindlessly respond to environmental cues, in a kind of bottom-up processing of the world as we find it. Walking into your office, check your schedule for the day. Holding an empty bottle, throw it in the trash. Hearing the doorbell ring, open the door. This is the effortless, habitual way of persisting to meet our goals. What behaviors do you want to change? Maybe you want to have regular family dinners. Establish channels of communication that are more open with your employees at work. Save money for retirement or your kids' college. Indulge more often in cultural offerings available to you. All these can be integrated into that part of your life guided by habitual behavior. They can become what you automatically do. Habits work for us in ways that our conscious decisions never can.